Thank you, Eric. And I think, as Eric mentioned, this is it's been a journey that's now gone over 2 years, I think, and the journey is still going because although we released a report, it's about communicating the findings of that report and also working with the regions to support the implementation or activation of those recommendations. So I'll talk about mainly about the NSPA report today. I just also wanted to locate the analysis and findings of the report within broader debates that are going on around regional growth and development across the OECD. And then the presentation basically follows the structure of the report. I'll talk a bit about the findings and analysis for the NSPA as a whole across the NSPA, and then focusing in on the recommendations for Sweden and for the 4 northern counties as well. So, just regional growth trends in Sweden with a picture of Stockholm, which links to my next point. So, I was trying to find a simple way to explain some of this broader context, and it comes back to a regional outlook, which we release every 2 years, and we released our last regional outlook in 2016, which had a focus on both rural areas, but also about this challenge which all OECD countries face around, to differing degrees, around low productivity and increasing inequalities, and the observation that the two of them are linked. And so if you think about how productivity growth occurs, I guess one way is to think about the frontier. So you have firms and regions at the frontier. Those firms which are producing new products and services, new technologies, ways of doing things, and those firms and regions at the frontier are very important. And the ones at the frontier are usually the big cities. And so the process of productivity growth is that you need them performing well, but you also need the diffusion of those technologies and capital into other firms and to other regions which are lagging behind. And so this process of catching up, of convergence in terms of productivity growth is very important. And our analysis shows that this process is not working as well as it has in the past. And when you look at across OECD countries, you see between countries convergence is occurring. So over time, their economies are becoming more similar. There's convergence in per capita income and convergence in terms of labour productivity. But when you look within countries, you tend to see a pattern of divergence, as in cities and regions which are doing well, which are wealthy, are growing faster, and the rest are falling further behind. And what we feel is this then is contributing to some of the backlash against globalisation, some political discontent, which we can observe in OECD countries, because ultimately all politics is local. So how people experience the economy is not so much in the aggregate sense around the growth and employment at a national level, but it's about how they're experiencing it locally. So in their local area, if wages are falling, if there's not as many jobs being created, and there's also a perception that others are doing better, this then feeds this feeling of discontent. And although Sweden is, amongst or has the least interregional disparities within OECD countries, you can see that within Sweden there is also this process of divergence. So Stockholm here is the richest region, and its labour productivity is also growing the fastest. And then you see these bars represent the gap between those other regions and Stockholm. So you can see the gap in the very north of the country, where Västerbotten is located, is the smallest. And this is partly because of the mining activity there. But you can see then, as we move down, Småland with the islands where we are now, or West Sweden and South Sweden are even falling further behind. And when we've done some analysis recently, because we've done several reports, we've done monitoring review, different territorial reviews within Sweden, you can see this pattern being exacerbated by the crisis. So if you look at the period 2007 to 2014, Stockholm's share of the national economy increased by 29.2% to 31.6%. Now that doesn't sound a lot, but it's also in a relatively short period of time. So. And this chart here is tracking from 2000 to 2013. So in a sense, if we extrapolated those trends 50 years into the future, you might have a situation where perhaps Stockholm takes up 2/3 of the national economy instead of 1/3. So the question then, from a national point of view, is that a good thing to occur? So, and I guess from our point of view, it's probably not a good thing, because what you see in cities are diseconomies of scale. So cities are very beneficial, but they also generate costs. And over time, as those costs increase, they cost a lot to address. So those costs around traffic congestion, around pollution is another one, but also costs in terms of the cost of housing as well. And so if you look at the two risks which have been identified for Sweden by the OECD, one is around housing, the cost of housing, and the second is around labour market matching. So if you continue to have a trend where growth is increasingly concentrated in Stockholm, it's not good for either of those risks. It, in fact, it exacerbates both those risks. So what we tried to do in this report in the NSPA, is look at how, over time, you can increase productivity and activate growth in the northern parts of the country. So, in terms of the findings across the NSPA, so we looked at the NSPA as a whole and ran some analysis and recommendations about how these regions are performing, what's driving their growth, and where they can enhance cooperation between them to promote growth into the future. So the NSPA, most of you all know it. It's the northern parts of Sweden, Norway, and Finland. I think it's important, when we explain this in Brussels or in Paris, I guess the size and scale of these places. So, they're relatively big and sparsely populated in a European context. They're not very similar. They're not similar to other regions in Europe. They're more similar to regions that we see in Canada, or where I'm from in Australia, or Chile, for example. They share these characteristics of low density, their resource-based economies, and the harsh climate, and also that in European and national policy settings around the Arctic, this part of the world is becoming more important from both an economic and a geopolitical point of view. So economic in terms of as a source of raw materials, of wood, of biomass, of energy, and also geopolitical in terms of what the future of the Arctic looks like in relation to the other great powers of the world, but also in the context of climate change as well. And within all that, there's the important point about how you promote sustainable economic development and growth in these places. So if you want places which are secure and prosperous, this has to be part of that picture about the Arctic, about Arctic policy. I think, as Eric said before, it's not just about preserving it, it's also about how you promote development and growth in a sustainable way in these places. So this chart represents GDP per capita for all OECD regions in terms of the growth rate between 2000 and 2012 and their level of GDP per capita. And the regions in Sweden are located in the middle. So in the context of the OECD, these regions are actually performing quite well, and they're relatively wealthy within that context as well. So an important message that we have in our work is that rural is not synonymous with decline, and certainly in some of these regions you can see quite strong growth performance relative to other OECD regions. When we decompose that growth into its different components, so we looked at the composition of growth of GDP growth within its different elements of productivity, population, and employment. What you can see, first of all, and the colours represent whether it's above, green is above zero and red is below. In terms of population, you can see for 13 of the 14 regions, their population is declining, and this is a common trend across across many rural regions. So the population is ageing faster, and in overall sense tends to be declining at a relatively slow rate, but still declining over time. What we could see in terms of productivity is, I think it's 8 of the 14 experienced productivity growth. If you look at the regions in Sweden, you can see that 3 of the 4 experienced productivity growth in that period. Lapland was slightly below. As I mentioned, all experienced the the declining population, but also strong employment growth. So the trend of population decline can be ameliorated, of course, through migration and so forth. But again, it's a structural issue across OECD countries, and these regions are no different. But the thing which you can influence, one is productivity. Obviously, you can influence productivity within regions, and you can also influence employment growth as well. So, and then particularly as the population ages, you have to think a bit more about how you can activate your existing workforce better, particularly young people or older people which have fallen out of the workforce, or people with low skills. So then it becomes an issue about how you better activate those people into employment. Now, if we looked at we looked also at the factors which influence productivity performance across those different regions. So, first of all, national factors play a role. So, in Norway, it's the specialisation in oil and gas, so that has a filtered down effect into regional productivity. When you look at the trends across different regions, you can see that, for example, in Norrbotten and Västerbotten, they have quite strong productivity performance, and this is linked to the mining sector within those places as well. It's not just an issue of the natural resource-based industries, but obviously also where you sit within global value chains as well is important. So where you are in terms of how much value you add and how much value you're able to capture within the region as well has an impact. Of course, the enabling factors are important, so that the quality of the skills, the quality of the infrastructure within these places, both transport and digital infrastructure, plays a role. And then I think particularly for a region like Västerbotten is this issue about population size and density. So when you look at the rural, the northern regions of Sweden, they actually have quite a concentrated settlement structure. So they actually have quite dynamic urban economies as well. So a place like Umeå is quite a dynamic urban economy with quite a diverse economic structure, with university, with research and innovation assets. So this is important in terms of driving future growth, but it's also important in terms of, over time, if you have a more concentrated settlement structure, it enables you to deliver public services in a more cost-effective way, and also creates an environment which is more likely to attract and retain young people, young families as well. It's not to say that rural is not important, but because then the issue becomes of how do you better link the urban centres with the rural centres, both in a governance sense, for example, cooperation between municipalities, but also the infrastructure links and transport service links as well. So what we did from that is to develop I guess a bit of a roadmap for future cooperation across the NSPA, and of course this tries to build on the existing cooperation which is occurring, because there's cooperation between regions, there's cooperation which is supported by the European Commission, there is cooperation through structures like the Nordic Council of Ministers and the Barents cooperation. But what we thought is that it's timely, given with the new cohesion policy, is to take a bit of a stock take of that existing cooperation, look at where it can be consolidated, and refocused around a set of priorities, which are the ones that we identify on the screen here around, which I've already talked about, is around the ageing and the labour markets, so and service delivery, innovation, and how you better diffuse innovations which are occurring across the NSPA to other regions, how you improve east-west transport cooperation and therefore those linkages over time, and also how you facilitate cooperation and complementarities in terms of smart specialisation between different regions, because you're all relatively small and lack scale. So coming together is going to improve how your capacity to deliver on those policies. And so we as I mentioned, we said refocus those collaborations and then potentially formalise a work program for the NSPA and better link that to national decision making. So I think what we found is that there was a strong focus on the EU level, which is very important, but also the other important element is how you can better shape national policies as well, because when you're talking about things like service delivery and around infrastructure, it's really the national government that plays the primary role there. And within that, we also indicated that the NSPA faces these structural disadvantages, and if you want to continue to have sustainable economic growth in these places, you need to support them in that sense. So, for example, around the higher unit cost of delivering public services. So, in terms of the recommendations for Sweden, and again, this reinforces the points that I was making before around the NSPA. So, they're around 9% of the economy and the population, the 4 northern counties, but over half the land area, and this is reflected in the economic strengths of those places around the natural resource-based sectors, which are very important to the export income of the country, and also in terms of how they then interact with other industries within Sweden as well. So the professional and business services located in Stockholm, or manufacturing sector in the centre and the south of the country as well. And then the key role they also play in the national energy markets. But also it's not just about raw materials and minerals and wood and so forth. It's also about the unique products and services which are created in the north, which are a source of comparative advantage for Sweden. And we saw examples of that on the missions that we did around the testing of technologies, because if technologies work there, they tend to work anywhere. The work around how you deliver public services in a remote context, and then quite unique tourism experiences as well, which are a part of Sweden's overall tourism offer. And we did some estimates in the monitoring review of how much it actually costs in terms of doing the cost equalisation for low density, and we found the cost is actually quite small. I mean, you're talking, as it says on the slide there, what was written on the slide, 0.2% of GDP. So in terms of the growth factors within Sweden, again, relative to other rural areas in the OECD, it's not easy to see this on the slide, but this is comparing the regions to the national average across different factors. So the first two here are high skilled and low skilled. So you can see that in terms of high skilled and low skilled, they're relatively close to the national average, which means they're in a relatively strong position in terms of overall skill level in the labour market. And then also in terms of high-speed internet, some are below, but it's not far. It's not the level of dispersion that you see in some other OECD countries, and I think this reflects this overall commitment to equality within Sweden. But it also means that relative to other rural places in Europe and across the OECD, which you are competing with, you're in a relatively strong position in relation to those key factors which drive growth. In each of the case studies, what we did was we started off with this point about what drives growth in rural economies, and because markets are small in rural economies, it's really about what you export. And then because you're also small, you can only specialise in a relatively small range of things. So in terms of your policies around smart specialisation, around infrastructure and skills, it's really about trying to focus in on what are those areas of absolute advantage, as in where you have a productivity advantage relative to other regions, what sectors and activities that is in, and then how do you diversify around them? How do you add extra value? And so what we did for each of the regions is to do some analysis on what that looks like. And although they share similar characteristics, there's also quite a bit of internal diversity within the NSPA, and you can certainly see that within these regions. So, I mean, Norrbotten and Västerbotten are similar in a sense that they have this mining, which is important, and then the link and how they've been able to develop links to research and innovation, and then diversify around that has been important. And then they also have a similar settlement structure as well. Västernorrland is different. Obviously it's closer to Stockholm. It has more of a heavy industry past. It's experienced significant restructuring in its heavy industry. But it has that advantage of being close to Stockholm, so it's been able to begin to leverage that by having sort of administrative and financial services located in Västerbotten, which then can service into Stockholm. And Yapland is different again. It didn't really have an industry past, so and its settlement structure is quite different. Its population is more dispersed as well. So it's just saying that from a national point of view, you can't really have a one-size-fits-all solution for the north. It has to recognise and adapt to these differences, really focusing in on these areas of absolute advantage. And so for each of those regions, we developed some policy recommendations. I'm just providing a summary here on the slide. So the first was around smart specialisation, which is about continuing to refine those strategies, making sure that they're focused in on those areas of absolute advantage, and then they seek to identify complementarities with other regions within the NSPA. In terms of the workforce, it was and skills, it's around skills gaps, addressing low skills and workforce disengagement. So over time, how you better activate the potential workforce within these places, particularly people that have been affected by restructuring in traditional sectors, people living in rural areas, and young people as well. In terms of infrastructure, it's about improving the quality of infrastructure, so addressing small-scale bottlenecks related to those tradable sectors that I was talking about, and enhancing linkages between urban and rural areas. And one of the ways to do that is by regions taking a stronger role in terms of spatial planning. And then there's also, we identified some opportunities there to strengthen bespoke collaboration between regions based on transport corridors or common tourism destinations. In terms of the national government, there's three themes here. The first one was around how can the national government improve productivity and competitiveness in the northern regions. The first 2 points relate to smart specialisation. So first is the national government taking a more proactive role in working with regions around their smart specialisation strategies. So providing expertise and support and better linking those strategies with the national innovation policy. The second point is more around programs, how you better tailor programs and initiatives, particularly to small and medium-sized enterprises in these places, and how do you help them access new markets was the second one. The third was around tourism, so there's a lot of good tourism efforts going on within these regions, so it's about how you better link them up and scale them up and make them more part of the national tourism policy. And then in terms of labour market matching, it's about strengthening the role of the regional competency platforms. I think a practical first step here is providing better information, data and tools, and the competencies that the regions can use them so they can disseminate that information amongst different actors. In terms of connectivity and access to services, the national government again can play a role here around improving incentives and support for the diffusion of good practices between regions and between municipalities around service delivery. And also looking at, if you like, a bit of a rural proofing of different national regulations related to key service systems to look at how that they can be adjusted to support innovative responses to service delivery challenges in rural areas. And so, for example, how resources can be shared within and between school networks to enable the effective delivery of services in remote areas. And the third area was around governance, which was related to this to the monitoring review, which perhaps Verka will talk about. And I guess the two key points here were that one was around strengthening the role that the regional political body plays in terms of prioritising, integrating and delivering different components of the European structural and investment funds, so across regional, rural and skills. So that was the first thing that in order to get an integrated view of that of the economy of those different regional funding streams, that you need to bring those responsibilities into the political body. The second was to, if that body is strengthened around regional development, is then to link it with more effectively with spatial planning and transport planning as well. And then we had some recommendations there around governance. I think the important one is around the mergers of of regions and municipalities, particularly in low density areas. We recommended some careful analysis of that, because certainly there are benefits that come from merging within functional areas, so cities. You know, if you have less municipalities within cities, that generally we find that's a good thing, but we find that the benefits generally diminish in rural and remote areas, so some careful consideration of that. So there, we'll circulate the slides, I'm sure, but there's all the relevant links, and if you have any further questions, you can get in touch.